Welcome to another episode of Philosophy and Critical Thinking. In this episode, we are going to discuss barriers to critical thinking. So in the last video, we distinguished between deductive logic and inductive logic, and we saw how we could use both forms of logic to help us reason about the world and to come to know more things. In this video, we're going to think about some of the obstacles to thinking in those logical ways. So sometimes barriers to critical thinking come from outside one's own mind. We're going to focus in this video on some of the barriers that come from within one's own mind. So we're oftentimes our own worst enemy when it comes to thinking clearly. Things like our feelings or our emotions can get in the way of our thinking clearly. In cognitive psychology, which is a branch of psychology that focuses on cognition and thinking, there's a common distinction between two different kinds of thinking. So we're going to talk a little bit at the beginning here about what those two kinds of thinking are, and then see how these two kinds of thinking can get in the way of one another. All right, so the distinction is between what's sometimes called System 1 thinking and System 2 thinking. System 1 thinking is fast, automatic, and unconscious, whereas System 2 thinking is slow, reflective, conscious, effortful. Here's an example to help you see what the difference is here. So I'm going to give you a question. This is a common question in psychology experiments. So we're just going to call it the bat and ball question. Suppose that a bat and ball cost $1.10. If the bat costs $1 more than the ball, then what does the ball cost? All right, System 1 thinking is probably telling you right now that the answer is 10 cents. That's the kind of thinking that results in a very quick judgment about what the answer is. You can activate your System 2 thinking, though, by checking your answer and asking yourself, could 10 cents be the correct answer? Right? And if you do that, you can see that 10 cents can't be the correct answer, and here's why. If the bat costs $1 more than the ball, and the ball costs 10 cents, then the bat costs $1 and 10 cents. Well, it's easy to add up $1.10 plus 10 cents. That would equal $1.20. But we said right at the beginning here that the bat and the ball cost a combined $1.20. So 10 cents can't be the correct answer. System 1 thinking is giving us the wrong answer, and we can only know that by engaging our slow, reflective kind of checking. All right, so there are many other examples that we could use like that to illustrate the difference. Basic point here is that there's a kind of fast automatic thinking and then a slow reflective kind of thinking. And if we want to get to the truth, oftentimes we're going to have to activate that slow reflective thinking to check our initial judgments. All right, so given this difference in two different kinds of thinking, we can use this distinction to help us understand some of the obstacles or barriers to critical thinking that come from within our own minds. Okay, in cognitive psychology, there have been many experiments to support the idea that we have what are called cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are not a kind of bigotry. They're not a kind of prejudice that we have against other people. It's not bias in that sense. Rather, it's bias in the sense of a disposition to think in a way that leads us away from the truth rather than closer to the truth. I'm going to give you some examples of some of these cognitive biases. So confirmation is a cognitive bias. This is a tendency in human thinking to search for information and interpret information in a way that confirms what one already believes to be true. So, for example, if I identify as a Democrat and I only consume news from MSNBC and CNN, I am setting myself up for a kind of critical thinking failure, because I am only consuming information from news media sources that are going to feed me what I already think is true. They're going to feed me stories that relate to the perspective that I already endorse, the political perspective that I already endorse. Alternatively, I might be someone who identifies as a conservative who only consumes news media from Fox News. If I'm doing that, I'm susceptible to confirmation bias to potentially the same degree as the liberal or Democrat identifying individual who only consumes news from MSNBC and CNN. All right, so that's confirmation bias. If we want to know more about the world, we're going to have to open ourselves up to different sources of information, to different ways of thinking about the world, and to bits of information that we might find unsettling or that we might find doesn't necessarily agree with what we already think is true. We're going to have to be open-minded. All right, now confirmation bias runs quite deep in human psychology. We can surround ourselves with people who think in like-minded ways. If you look at information about dating apps, for instance, it's a deal breaker for many people when they see that a potential mate has a difference of political opinion. Right? This is one of the biggest deal breakers on dating apps, is the other person's political affiliation. So if I decide consciously to only surround myself with like-minded people, I am just exacerbating this problem of confirmation bias. All right, there are some other barriers to critical thinking that take the form of cognitive biases. So motivated reasoning is another kind of bias. This is a tendency in human thinking to come up with justifications to believe what I want to be true, rather than to believe what's based on the evidence. So take an example like philosophizing about whether there's an afterlife or not. Is there somewhere that we go when we die? Is death just the end, the total annihilation of the self? It's not hard to see how motivated reasoning could creep into our psychology here and influence how we think about the issue. After all, you might think that it would be really good for us if there were a good place after we die that we get to go to and see, maybe family and friends or something like that. And so we have a kind of stake in the issue. We have a horse in the race, so to speak. So there's a certain conclusion that we want to arrive at, and that could influence how we reason about the evidence. We could ask the question, is there good evidence for an afterlife? You might focus on things like near-death experiences, for instance. That's sometimes presented as empirical support for an afterlife. But how are we thinking about that evidence? Are we prone to accept it as evidence for the afterlife, in part because we want there to be an afterlife? Or are we evaluating the evidence in a kind of sober, reflective way where we're setting our feelings and emotions aside? Right? So we want to be careful not to reason in a motivated way towards conclusions that we want to be true, but rather simply evaluate the evidence for what it is. All right, some other barriers to critical thinking that take the form of cognitive biases. Being closed-minded, that's a cognitive bias. Right? To be closed-minded is to not give serious attention to possibilities that conflict with what you already think is true. Black and white thinking, that's another cognitive bias. The tendency to think that there's at most two positions to be taken on an issue, when oftentimes things are more gray rather than simply black and white. Groupthink, or intragroup bias, is another kind of cognitive bias. This is where a desire for harmony within a group motivates how one forms beliefs and makes decisions. So if people around me tend to think in a certain way or make decisions in a certain way, I am going to be more likely to also think in that way or those ways and make decisions in those ways. It's very difficult to overstate the influence of what people around you think on your own psychology. So a great example of intergroup bias would be something like the way sports fans tend to think about their own team, the team that they root for and cheer for. They tend to play up evidence that makes their team look good and their rivals look bad, while downplaying evidence that cuts the other way. Same kind of thing happens in politics and religion. So Republicans, for instance, tend to play up things that make Democrats look bad and tend to downplay things that make Republicans look bad. Democrats obviously do this too, just in the reverse kind of way. And there have been experimental studies that show just how deep this sort of bias runs in our psychology. There was a book by Drew Weston, who's a political scientist, called The Political Brain, The Role of Emotion in Deciding the Fate of the Nation, where Weston describes different studies that reveal just how significant political affiliation can be on one's evaluation of evidence. So in one study, individuals in an experiment were given a kind of statement where the statement was describing a celebrity who did something that seemed quite hypocritical. But if the celebrity identified as a Republican, then in the group of Republicans who were asked to evaluate the celebrity's behavior, they were more likely to suggest that the celebrity didn't do anything wrong necessarily, or there was a kind of explanation for why they did what they did. Whereas for a group of Democrats who were evaluating a self-identified Republican celebrity who did something that seemed hypocritical, they were more likely to accept the evidence that the celebrity behaved badly. And it was also shown in the study that the pleasure centers of our brains become more activated when we criticize members of an opposing political party. Right? So that just goes to show you, if you have dopamine that gets released and you feel pleasure whenever you criticize someone from another group, that's going to be a huge kind of psychological incentive for you to continue engaging in acts of criticism of a rival political group. All right, so we are susceptible to lots of different cognitive biases or influences in our thinking that tend to lead us away from the truth. Why are we like this? Right? Why aren't humans hardwired to ignore these irrelevant influences over our thinking? Why don't we think perfectly logically and perfectly rationally about things? Here's an interesting suggestion. So in what's called evolutionary psychology, it's taken to be a working assumption, taken to be true, that our minds evolved just like our bodily traits evolved. So we can ask questions about, why do humans have the traits that they do? Biological traits. And there's an evolutionary story to be told about why we are the way that we are. Now, we could also use that evolutionary story to explain why we have the psychological traits and tendencies that we do. All right, now if we apply evolutionary psychology to human thinking, we can come up with plausible explanations for why, say, we want what we want, why humans are so insatiable, right? We never seem satisfied in a kind of lasting, long-term way. We tend to all want similar things. Two very natural desires for humans are desires for fame or social status and desires for fortune or wealth, right? So why do we want these things? Why do we experience pain when we're insulted? Why do we tend to be worrywarts? Humans tend to worry quite often and feel like constantly anxious about things. All right, so why are we these ways? The insight from evolutionary psychology is that our evolutionary past shapes our current psychological makeup. Now, think about what the evolutionary environment would have been like for our hunter-gatherer ancestors, where they were living in small groups of maybe between 50 and 100 people rather than in huge cities. If we ask, what was that evolutionary environment like? Well, it was one where there were huge pressures to conform within a group. If you thought something different from what the group thought, and you expressed that, you might be viewed as an outsider, and you might get kicked out of the group. Well, getting kicked out of the group in a hunter-gatherer society is very dangerous, because you can't survive on your own out there in the wilderness where there are beasts trying to eat you, and you don't have teams of people to help you hunt or gather food. So it's very important for there to be group cohesion and for you to not upset the other members of your group. Whereas today, it doesn't matter if you upset someone else who happens to live in the same city as you. They might just be a total stranger, and it's not going to make your life any worse. It's not going to be like you get kicked out of the group and now you can't find food anymore. Or now things are more dangerous for you out there in the world. Like you're going to get eaten by a grizzly bear now that you've disagreed with a random stranger on the sidewalk. So when it comes to why we tend to think in a way that's motivated by, say, like intergroup bias or confirmation bias, it becomes quite obvious why we would be that way today. Those ways of thinking were advantageous to our ancestors in hunter-gatherer tribes, and then we have sort of inherited all of that psychological baggage, even though thinking in those ways today in a different environment, one with civilization, doesn't necessarily help us live better lives. All right, think about this question, why do we seek fame and fortune? Well, imagine, again, a hunter-gatherer ancestor who didn't care about fame and fortune, who didn't care about acquiring more stuff, who didn't care about social status in their group. Well, if they didn't care about their status within the group, and they didn't care about collecting lots of squirrel meat or berries to store up, then they would have been significantly less likely to survive and pass on their genes. Because if you're living in an environment where it's very difficult to find food, you're going to want to keep any food that you can find. You're going to become a food hoarder. And you're also going to not want to be kicked out of the group and have to survive on your own or try to survive on your own. You're going to want other people within your group to help defend you against attacks and to help you forage for food. So you're really going to care about what other people in your group think of you. You don't want to be, canceled by the group and get kicked out and have to live on your own. So things like social status would be very important. Things like wanting more stuff would be very important for hunter-gatherer individuals. Again, fast forward, tens of thousands of years, we have inherited those psychological tendencies to want more and more things and to care deeply about what others around us think. But do these tendencies to think in these ways help us live better lives in the current environment? Probably not, right? You don't need to hoard a bunch of stuff nowadays. You don't have to worry that there's going to be a drought and you're not going to be able to get food. You can still go to H-E-B to get your food. You don't have to worry if you upset someone in, say, a class that you're in, because it's not going to impact your likelihood of survival and reproduction in the way that it would have for a hunter-gatherer ancestor of yours. So the basic suggestion in evolutionary psychology is that we tend to think in the ways that we do today because those ways of thinking benefited our ancestors. Now, once we know that, though, or have good reason to believe it, we can ask ourselves, are these good ways of thinking in today's environment? And it seems quite obvious that the answer to that is no. So in order to become a better critical thinker, we would have to be more aware of these potential obstacles to our seeking truth. We'd have to take some ownership over our thinking and try to sort out whether I'm thinking in this way because it coheres well with what people around me think. Am I thinking in this way because it's based on the evidence? Am I pursuing this goal that I have because it would have been a goal that a hunter-gatherer ancestor of mine would have found enticing? Or do I really think it's something worthwhile to pursue? Right, so awareness of these barriers to critical thinking can help us as individuals exercise more freedom over our own choices and our own thoughts, and help us think in ways that tend to lead us closer to rather than away from the truth.